Lawrence set out onto the streets. The breath of fog from people walking merrily arose as he went, illuminated by the morning sun. When Lawrence came to the marketplace, it was crowded even before he entered it. There were mules loaded heavily with green frost-resistant vegetables, and men carrying barrels full of vinegar so strong it made the eyes water. There was a cart filled with rock salt that accompanied by armed guards, which bore the seal and standard of some nobleman. Lawrence did not know if it was meant for this marketplace or on its way somewhere else, but it was amusing to watch sharp-eyed youngsters be chased off by the guards like so many flies. Perhaps they were trying to pick up any bits of salt that fell to the ground and turn them into a bit of spending money. If such a heavy guard was necessary, then the profit from sneaking salt as false stone statues must be sizable. Lawrence thought of Eve, who had sneaked right out of town one night and was now surely doing some business somewhere else in the south. He found himself less envious than simply astonished. Such thoughts occupied his mind as he wandered the marketplace, inhaling the myriad of scents that wafted from the stalls as he walked by each one. If there was this much in the market, buying what he needed ought not be a trouble. He passed barrels filled with carp, which splashed water up as they swam vigorously about, and arrived at a cheesemonger's shop, with the cheese lined up for the display. Cheese did not spoil quickly, and it was filling. And there was another way to eat it. He had learned long ago that he would remember until the end of his days. The cheese was put to the flame, melted as though one was boiling water. Then bread or anything else could be dipped generously in it and eaten. It was originally a dish from the south, but the colder the weather, the more magnificent it became. Lawrence got excited just thinking about how enthusiastic he imagined Holo and Co. would be to try it. As he imagined the scene, Lawrence became aware of the shopkeeper's appraising eye on him. The man was placing a large, square, carved stone on one side of a great set of scales. Lawrence rubbed his face as though blaming the cold. Then he raised a smile from his face and raised his voice. "I'd like a wheel of cheese. How much?" Given the number of foreign travelers, the shop did not bother with anything that indicated prices. Moreover, at Lawrence's question, the thin shopkeeper, who looked more like a shepherd than a cheesemonger, only continued to look at Lawrence curiously. "That one, for example," said Lawrence, indicating the large wheel about to be weighed. The shopkeeper's apprentice also awaited the master's orders, his face red from effort as he handled the wheel. I suppose you arrived yesterday or today," replied the shopkeeper finally. Like an old man who was hard of hearing, he then gave his apprentice a signal to put the cheese on the scale. A baker's scale was big enough, but the balance beam on the one side was even thicker. The chains, too, were free of any ornamentation at all. It was a very utilitarian device, and it clanked loudly when the cheese was loaded onto it. "I arrived the day before last, heading even farther north." Lawrence swallowed back anything else he might have said after that, and the shopkeeper suddenly looked over his shoulder and reached out for an iron rod. At the end of the rod was a small plaque, with it writing carved into it. Standing on tiptoe and looking farther into the shop, he could see the box into which the plaque end of the iron rod had been thrust. Within the box smoldered charcoal, which heated the brand such that it could mark the cheese. "I see. Bad luck, then." It was a hissing sound, and soon the fragrant smell of the charring cheese hit Lawrence's nose. It's not neglect that there are no prices out. These have all sold. Lawrence barely had time to make a sound of surprise before the man continued. "That one, this one, and this one there, too, are all being taken away today. It's good to have a rush in business, but it's dizzying, too. And I've got to endure the sad faces of all the unlucky travelers as well. Lawrence did not put his hand to his face, instead managing to a cherished smile that was still probably rather pathetic. Well, it's nice that business is good. Even a few weeks before the trouble with the furs, the aftermath of the cancellation of the Northern campaign, and the heavy taxes would have all but stagnated the marketplace. Aye, but the business came back all of a sudden. Truly, I suppose it's something like the weather. When it's nice out, people come and shop, don't you think? A merchant who dealt in something that kept so well as cheese could surely as cheese did, could surely live a well-kept life. The fact that he seemed a bit musty was due in part to Lawrence's own youth. I quite agree, incidentally. Is tomorrow's cheese also spoken for, or the day after's? Lawrence asked, at which the shopkeeper nodded heavily. The queue was apparently very long indeed. Lawrence scratched his head in consternation, and the shopkeeper pretended to ignore his predicament. Our cheese goes well with wine, though. The tavern keeps quite a stock on hand. Huh? Lawrence looked back at the shopkeeper in surprise. But the shopkeeper was already pretending Lawrence was not there, instead busily giving orders to his apprentice. Though he could not say so openly, the shopkeeper had essentially told Lawrence that if he went to the tavern, they might smash him some cheese there. A town separated in specialties, such that these cheesemongers sold cheese and the tavern sold wine. The cheesemonger could not operate as a drinking establishment, nor was the tavern allowed to sell cheese in quantity. But there were always exceptions to rules. Apparently, this shopkeeper was of an accommodating disposition. My thanks to you. I'll give that a try this evening, then, said Lawrence. Aye, you do that. Oh, and the shopkeeper called out to Lawrence as the latter began to walk away. It's going to be much the same for anything else you want to buy. Don't bother looking at the shops. It's the storehouses you'll want to peek in. And Lawrence found himself briefly lost in thought at these words, and he was soon carried off by the flow of people. The cheesemonger was soon out of sight. It's the storehouses you'll want to peek in. That was another thing that ought not have to been said out loud. And just as the shopkeeper had said, Lawrence soon discovered that of all the goods he had hoped to find in the market, he could get none at all, or not enough, or else the only thing left were the scraps none of the other customers would buy. And yet the prices were not so very high. What kept running through Lawrence's head was the earlier trouble in Lenox with furs. The market was so busy, it made a merchant like Lawrence almost angry to be in it, so he left, making straight for a less crowded street. His destination was somewhere no proper merchant would be, the Beast and Fish Tale. Before the Beast and Fish Tale's back door, there stood a wagon, loaded with various crates and barrels, and counting them with visible irritation was none other than the same barmaid. Despite her brusqueness, the boy minding the wagon was only too happy to answer her every question as she demanded this or that piece of information from him. She was a marvelous witch of a girl, but could she hear the voice in his mind that said so? Lawrence waited for her to finish purchasing what goods she needed, then picked a likely moment to approach. When the barmaid looked over her shoulder and noticed him, she was utterly unmoved. "Goodness, you're early today," she said, as though their exchange the prior day had never happened. Or else she had given up on pushing and was going to try and pull instead. Quiet. Haste can be a virtue after all. The girl scratched something into a wax-covered board, then looked up at him as though she were counting money given to her by a drunkard. Then she sighed. "So what profit is it you're chasing this time, eh?" It was obvious he was interrupting her work, but Lawrence kept his affable smile up and answered proudly, "Nothing like that. I was hoping you'd let me buy a little from you." The barmaid's expression was the very epitome of a suspicious face. She raised one eyebrow, and the "huh?" she was thinking to herself was entirely obvious. If taverns start selling goods, the town would be in chaos. Why not go to the marketplace? I'm a little busy here. Having finished her count, the girl tucked the board under her arm and poked her head through the back door, shouting something into the tavern. She certainly was not going to bring all of these goods inside herself, so perhaps she was calling for the master of the shop. I'm sure you are, if you're planning to use all of this in your cooking. She kept her head impudently in the doorway, with her nicely shaped rear facing the street. If she had had a rabbit tail, it would surely have been twitching. The barmaid finally turned to regard him, a look of frustration on her face. These are extra supplies in case of hardship. I'll bet they are, said Lawrence with a smile. The barmaid averted her gaze and scratched her head. She was obviously unsure what to do. I'll pay in cash, gold coin if you like, or he offered the choice he would give in any normal business transaction. Would smaller coins be better? The girl finally sighed. I see, she said. I see how it is. As soon as you figured things out, you came straight here. Where'd you get that idea, I wonder? She looked up at the sky as though she dropped her coin purse somewhere, hands on her hips, eyes closed. Every one of her exaggerated gestures was deeply amusing. If she quit her job at the tavern, she could surely find work as a dancing girl. The value of coin is rising, isn't it? The girl nodded at Lawrence's words. But these truly are emergency supplies. Lawrence briefly greeted the shopkeeper, whose head had just emerged from the doorway. I'm sure they are, he said. Only very recently the town had been in chaos. Regardless of how accustomed the residents were becoming to such conditions, its effects were unmistakably lingering, especially when it came to trade. Just yesterday, Lawrence had been reminded of when he and Holo had first come to this town and been swept up in fallen noble and brilliant merchant Eve's fur trading schemes. The city had then decided that in exchange for selling furs to foreign traders, they would accept only cash. Furs were much more profitable to sell after being processed and turned into clothing, rather than as a raw commodity. Thus, the craftsmen who made their living by the processing of fur had absolutely no desire to sell their furs to outside traders, but it would have been difficult for the city to outright ban the sale of furs to foreign merchants. In the worst case, there could be violent rebellion on the part of those merchants. So using the church, they required that all business be conducted in cash. Since no one traveled long distances carrying large amounts of coin, this seemed like a splendid plan. There was no ban on sales, but there was simply nothing to purchase with. It was thought that this town would settle everything, but the church that handed down this decision added another condition that made things even more complicated. The church had its own coffers, which were always full of money, and in order to solidify their power base, they sought someone through whom they could lend money to the outside, and thus did they loan a large amount of money to foreign merchants. The furs were bought up by the foreign merchants, and their enraged craftsmen rioted. That was about the end of the story, but such disturbances always leave their claw marks behind. The consequences here were that, since the merchants had brought up the furs and fled, the town's money was now concentrated in the hands of a very few. And whenever there was such concentration, instability came with it. In this case, the value of currency shot up. Since the riot, it's like the money dried up from the town. There's no money anywhere you go. It vanished like smoke. Even if you allow that many trades to happen on credit, you still need small coins. We're in real trouble, said the barmaid as they talked in the tavern cellar. Its walls were lined up with all things Lawrence had been unable to buy in the marketplace. They say anything scarce becomes dear, said Lawrence. There's too much cash in the hands of the fur dealers, but because coin shortages is a problem for any town, it's not as though we can't import some coppers, and now even a dull copper is starting to look as brilliant as any gold. During times of cash only business, the clever ones would bet that the value of the currency would eventually fall to its former levels, but while it was high, they would buy as many goods as they could, and that was why the marketplace condition was as strange as it was. And as a tavern, you can easily avoid any accusation that you're speculating. Very clever. Lawrence wrote his prices on a wooden slate and handed it over. The barmaid wrinkled at her nose and rewrote all the figures. Too high, said Lawrence. Feel free to try your luck in that marketplace, constantly dealing as she did with so many drunken patrons. The girl was tougher than any grizzled merchant. Her position was strong. They had no need to sell Lawrence anything. Understood, but I'll be expecting quality. That's a compromise I can make. Given the satisfied way she looked at the slate, it was all too clear how cheaply that tavern had originally obtained the goods. There was no winning against an opponent with cunning, capital, and the nerve. Still, I'm a bit surprised, said the girl. Oh? That you come alone? I've come alone more times than not. The girl put her index finger to her chin. I suppose that's true, she murmured. My companion told me not to think. A jewel can shine alone, though. Hearing those words, the barmaid's smile was as bright as a gem. So, will the next few days be all right? Yes, if you please. And it would be best if you could take delivery in morning, although not too early. We're a tavern, after all. The girls seemed like the sort who rose with the dawn and immediately got to work. But there was a certain charm to the idea of her lollying, lazy, about in the bed for a while, too. Understood. Not too late, not too early. Timing is of the essence, after all. Lawrence mused that he had heard those words an awful lot recently, and then realized there was one more thing he had meant to ask. Has the letter come yet? Speaking of timing, no, not yet. If it's urgent, I'll have it sent to your inn once it arrives. If you please, said Lawrence, and took his leave of the girl. She deliberately betrayed no particular regret at the parting, not even looking at Lawrence. Instead, she vaguely waved the slate in his general direction. Though traveling merchants made their living amid hellos and goodbyes, they could not hold a candle to those who worked in taverns. The world was a big place, and there was always a bigger fish. Well then, murmured Lawrence to himself. This had all taken longer than he expected. He considered going to the stables, but then Hollow's hungry, displeased face flashed across his mind. He sighed and decided to hurry back to the inn. He got his bearings and headed down an alley in order to avoid the crowded streets. He wound up having to press himself against the wall in order to let some woman carrying full baskets on her heads go by. In place of offering thanks, they gave him large smiles. Perhaps the barmaid at the Beast and Fishtail was not so bewitching after all. Perhaps he was just accustomed to Lenos. He thought about it as he made his way down to the narrow alley, when he suddenly emerged onto a slightly broader street. Directly in front of him was a very familiar building. So he was out of business, eh? It was old Arnold's Inn. At Lawrence and Hollow's had stayed the last time they were in Lenos. Currently its master headed south on a pilgrimage. Originally it had been a very busy tannery, but circumstances had forced it closed, and it had become an inn. The dormitories for the many apprentices had become rooms for the travelers to stay in. Their permission to run the inn had been transferred to the Link Company, who had held Hollow as collateral, but Lawrence could hardly imagine them opening an inn. Once they sold the permit to someone else, they would probably sell the building itself. The building must have seen many faces within its walls, but now it was silent, expressionless like some cast-off shell. Perhaps that was why. Once put an obstinate expression, grinned wearily at no one. He was imagining himself opening up some small shop there. Nothing as big as Phylon's general store, but perhaps a business serving road-weary travelers for whom the journey itself was home. And taking care of the quietly thriving little shop would be him and one other. How absurd. Lawrence chuckled in self-reproach. Inside a long-suffering sigh. It would surely be a mistake to imagine that he would be the only one who would be sentimental about the approaching end of their journey. Hollow was thinking many of the same things, no doubt, but showing them less obviously in her manner of words. Even so, if he continued his idling much longer, he would certainly risk her ire. And given that her nose was keener than any hound's, he would need to put a tight lid on anything that stank of sentimentality. Lawrence let his weakness go as though kicking the dust from his feet and resolved to put this in behind him. What stopped him in his tracks was the emergence of someone from the inn, which he had assumed to be deserted. "Huh?" said the figure who stepped out from the inn, looking at Lawrence. Which was probably Lawrence's imagination, but the figure did indeed make a face of surprise, although his mouth moved just slightly. Lawrence himself was just as shocked. The man who had stepped out of the inn was one of the four masters of the Delay Company. If Lawrence recalled correctly, his name was Luz Eddingen. So will that all be all right? From across the way, Lawrence could hear the same slithering, serpentine voice, but it was not directed at him. Eddingen looked over his shoulder and addressed the others who were following him out of the building. Yes, though the remaining goods would need to be inspected. I was told by the former owner that they could be disposed of. No, that won't do at all. They were probably used for smuggling. We'll consider disposal after they've been inspected. Given the contents of the conversation, they were probably town officials, perhaps conducting the many verifications that were involved in the transfer of a permit. Will, sir, come by the trading company later. If you've time, I've just taken delivery of a fine vintage. Came the invitation from one of the officials. Everyone wanted to earn the gratitude of a town official, but those officials only cared about gratitude of men like Eddingen. It spoke of Eddingen's position of strength in this town that he declined the invitation with a slight wave. No, I really must return to my own company. I've got an engagement to attend to, so if you'll excuse me. These last words were delivered with Eddingen looked at Lawrence. The official noticed this, of course, and also in Lawrence's direction, but expressed little interest in him. Well then, he said, with a bow, and walked off. Eddingen only spoke again once the official had rounded a distant corner and gone out of sight. Well, Mr. Kraft Lawrence, I thought it'd be quite a while before I saw you again. And here I was, sad to think the day would never come at all. Eve might one day make a triumphant return, attended by underlings who, like Eddingen, were accompanied in their own right. But given his own disposition, Lawrence knew himself would never be such a one. Not every successful man is an ambitious one. I'd welcome such good fortune. At Lawrence's words, Eddingen briefly flashed a smile of kindly old man, then cocked his head. Well, men such as us must treasure our connections. If you've time, do come visit the company. We've got a fine vintage on hand. They were the same words the official earlier had used. His smile turned ferocious, eyes angular and glittering as though set in polished gold. Well, I'll be off, then, he said, and began to walk away. He was dressed in the finest clothing, a long-sleeved coat, a warm-looking fur muffler, and even lightweight leather boots. It was strange to see a man dressed as he was walking about, without any attendants, but considering Eddingen's business, that lonely yet opulent bearing suited him perfectly. I could never imagine it. There was not time enough in the world to count all the stories of brave, unyielding men, who nonetheless could not defeat their loneliness. Even Hollow was no exception to that rule. Those who obtained the highest levels of achievement were the only ones who defeated it. In that sense, Lawrence had to afford Imogen a certain amount of respect as he watched the man walk away. "Now then," said Lawrence as he began to walk, only to suddenly look over his shoulder. He had a feeling that someone had suddenly ducked out of sight in the corner of his vision. Lawrence took a long look at the mostly deserted street, but saw no one spying on him. He decided it was his imagination and walked back to the inn. Upon returning, he found that it had not been his imagination and that Hala was most displeased. Lunch was cheese over rye bread, with a small amount of boiled beans on top of it. It was simple fare that seemed likely to accompany a book on a religious travel, but given that it brought an end to several straight days of Hala being able to eat her fill, she found it unacceptable. Evidently, Elsa had taken the lead and ordered it when the innkeeper had come to check on them. "Such food isn't nearly enough." Hala's angry shout was fortunately covered up by the noisy clatter of a passing wagon, but that did nothing to erase her anger. Her hood was sharply pointed thanks to her prickled ears, and her overcoat billowed around her like a noblewoman's skirts. "I'm not eating luxurious food every day and such a good thing," said Lawrence, earning himself an immediately sharp glare from the hollow. "Oh, so you're going to lecture me on this point as well, eh? I get it. Don't be so angry." Hollow seemed to have more to say on the matter, but simply harumphed and turned around. Fran had been a mercenary chaplain who had taught of God with the scriptures in her hand, but her goal had not been to save anyone's soul. Rather, it was delivered last rites. Chaplains who borrowed God's name to do their work were often called by another name, reapers. Her teachings were meant very specifically for the battlefield. Meanwhile, Elsa lived a thoroughly pure life by God's teachings. For Cole, whose goal was to learn the church law, but whose studies had come to halt because of the lack of funds, it had been an opportunity he would never have dared wish for. Lawrence felt it was altogether a good and proper thing for Cole to learn as much as he could from her. And then there was Hullo, who herself was well aware of that fact. While she had made every effort to hand down a bit of her wise wolf dignity to Cole, even if she had not, she still would have had no desire to trample on his thirst for knowledge in this situation. The result was that she could do nothing but watch, and ever since morning prayers had ended, she had simply followed along with Cole and as Elsa delivered her lesson. While she could bare her fangs and give the barmaid at the beast and fishtail a good challenge, it was hard to do the same toward someone like Elsa. Elsa had no particular design on Cole, and no matter how Hollow might snarl, she was the only one trying to compete. For the proud wise wolf, it was an unbearably foolish position to suffer, and so she vented her frustration upon Lawrence. She just loves to flaunt all her so-called knowledge, lecturing Cole on this and that, all the way to the church and all the way back. And who was it that saved the village? It was me. Hollow grumbled, going on and on about every little thing that irritated her, as if it happened to come to mind. Lawrence gave vague, non-committal replies as he gazed out onto the town. "And that's not the only part of my territory she's ruined. This is all because you said you'd put her up in my room. Our room. Are you even listening to me?" She stood on her toes, her face so close and so angry that Lawrence wondered if she was going to bite his nose off. Lawrence flinched away as she answered, "I'm listening," he said, and was about to continue, but found himself at a loss for words, and so gave up. No matter what angles he might try to take, he was well aware that it would only serve to rile her up further. For once, Hola was genuinely furious beyond the means of logic or sense to assuage. Her darling Cole was being instructed by another woman, and whatever had been bothering him ever since Kirube, he had not confided in Holo about it. The previous morning, he had begged Holo to let him go to morning prayers, and for some reason on the way back his worry seemed to have lifted. Lulu, of course, had been honestly pleased that this was so. She herself seemed to feel that the approach of the journey's end was cause for happiness, but in point of fact was rather jealous of Cole's attention. So while he certainly understood her irrational anger at the intrusion of Elsa, looking at Hollow, Lawrence could not help but smile. "Is something amusing to you?" she demanded, with fangs flashing keenly, demanding on his answer. It would be spared no mercy. Until just recently, and certainly when they had first met, Lawrence would have erased his smile and immediately betrayed his fear of her. But nowadays, he was able to meet even this mannerism with utter calm. "Oh yes, quite amusing," said Lawrence, taking Hollow's hand and pulling her out of the way of the wagon she was about to bump into. "I never thought I would see a wise wolf rage like this." Hollow tried to snatch her hand away from Lawrence's grasp, but Lawrence strengthened his grips till she was unsuccessful. "Come now, don't be so angry." His words were like oil on a fire, and Hollow only pulled away harder, acting like a child throwing a tantrum. Just as she was about to actually bite his hand off, Lawrence let go and placed his own, now empty hand on her head. I wasn't making fun of you." Hollow brushed his hand away and glared at him, but Lawrence only repeated himself. "I wasn't making fun of you." The street finally arrived at the port district of the town, and the field of view was suddenly much broader. The sailors and dock workers seemed to be taking a post-meal break as they sat around the piles of unloaded goods and chattered good-naturedly. "So what then?" Hollow's displeasure now seemed forced, as though she had lost track of exactly what it was she was so angry about in the first place. Either that, or she had never really known in the first place. There was, of course, the anger she had over feeling that Cole had been taken away from her, but previously such a thing would have never made her so angry, as though she had a favorite apple snatched out of her grasp. If Cole's attention had really been stolen from her, she would have accepted that reality, then taken logical, appropriate action given the entirety of the situation. And if all of her efforts, Cole did not come back to her, she would allow for that outcome and give up. That would have been worthy of the name Wise Wolf and be the sort of action one had perfected the noble way of the traveler would have taken. This was not baseless speculation either. The very reason Lawrence was able to travel with Hollow was regardless of how clumsy or foolish it made him look, he had always reached his hand out to her. In her relationship with others, Hollow always drew away first. She did it because she mistook it for the smart, noble thing to do, and because she insisted that it had served her well thus far, even though she hated being alone. In her interactions with Lawrence, though Hollow had stopped wearing that mask, "I just thought it might be nice for you to not act like the wise wolf," said Lawrence, gazing out at the port. Hollow looked wordlessly up at him, but her silence was not because she did not understand what he was saying. Rather, it was a look of shock that her secret had somehow been exposed. "Though it is a bit silly of you to be so worked up over worries that your dear Cole might be taken from you," Lawrence added. At this, Hollow seemed to find a solid reason to be angry, and she turned away pouting. Yet, as ever, her ears and tail were more eloquent than her tongue. Lawrence said quite exactly what he was thinking. "The truth is, you want to be even more selfish, don't you?" Hollow was proud, and being proud, she was very stubborn, and about her position, her role. While she had hated being revered as a god, if she received no praise at all, the truth might as well be that her loneliness would crush her. Whatever she might say, Hollow was a kind and serious wolf who wished to live up to the expectation of others. That was why, even after faced with open hostility from the villagers, she had hated them through the centuries. She never once bared her fangs at them. She was a kind and responsible, and she hated being lonely. Though she was pathetically trapped in a cage of her own construction, There was no personality that could have suited her better. No one could think less of you for being envious of or for showing that childish attachment. This isn't your wheat fields. Nobody here is worshipping you. Lawrence paused for a moment before continuing. You don't need to force yourself to simply endure things anymore. At the very least, I'm not thinking of you as some kind of god. It was late to say so, given how many times by now he had seen her pathetic awkward sides. But even saying so, he knew that her habits and ideals would not change easily after so much time. Still, after so many misadventures with Lawrence, she had finally opened up to him at least. There was a little he could do for her, but at the very least, Lawrence wanted to give her the push she needed to take her the first step. So why don't you stop taking out your frustration on me of enduring all that alone and just be a little more honest? I feel like that's more of what a wise wolf would do, don't you think? He had originally meant it as a bit of a joke, but the moment he looked over at Hollow, his mouth stopped moving. Hollow had put her hood down over her eyes. Her head was downcast, her shoulders drawn in. Hollow was stubborn and proud, but for all that, her heart was quite soft and fragile. Everything Lawrence had just said, she had surely thought to herself hundreds of times. What if she had just wanted to vent her frustration at Lawrence? His logic would have the precise opposite of its intended effect. He would have hurt her instead of helped her. Lawrence's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. Hollow's feet suddenly stopped in their tracks and a cold sweat dripped down Lawrence's back. People around them were watching, holding in his arms his great bundle of regrets. Lawrence dared come around in front of Hollow and look under her hood, past the chestnut brown hair in the shadows. Hollow was drawn inward and her shoulders trembled, and beneath her hood she seemed to be waiting for Lawrence uneasily. After all that talk, this is all that it takes to fluster you? You're rather full of yourself, said Hollow. Even if he could endure her anger, her tears were hard to bear. He knew he had that in common with many of men in the world, and when Hollow was unhappy with something, she was mercilessly in her expectation of it. She said, pushing Lawrence aside and starting to walk. The careless, foolish traveling merchant had no choice but to follow after her. I hardly need you to tell me such things. I'm perfectly aware of them. Lawrence swallowed the retort that came immediately to mind, but could not quite help from saying something. If so? Hollow stopped again and turned to face him. When Lawrence's words stuck in his throat, Hollow continued, closing in on him. If so, I ought to just act as I wish, you say. Just throw all my pride and wisdom as a wise wolf aside? Her tone from under her hood was a challenging one, and the irises of her eyes were as red as the reddish thickest wine. I have my own things to consider in my own way, but I'm not so clever as that. You want me to be honest here, polite there, but I can't simply be. And anyway, she said, clasping her hands together behind her back and looking off, you're only asking what would be most convenient for you. Anger shot down Lawrence's throat, as though he had swallowed something hot. He had no intention of speaking out of turn or saying too much if Hollows attempted to act as a wise wolf should act, were causing her suffering or making her angry, though she ought to discard the role. That was what he truly thought, and it had nothing to do with what was convenient for him. You know, that's not true, he said. Hollow looked over her shoulder at him, those red-tinged amber eyes of hers taking a good long look. They were not joking nor teasing, but neither conceding defeat nor full of suspicion. Truly? So her words were his confirmation. Truly, answered Lawrence, and Hollow looked at him as though she were staring right into his heart. Hollow closed the lids over her eyes and made an innocent expression that looked almost sleepy. Evidently, to close your opponent's mouth, you need only to close your own eyes. The moment that truth came to Lawrence, Hollow's eyes opened, and suddenly she smiled. "You are quite daring, though," she said. "Huh? Telling me to be more honest, here and now, of all places?" Hollow looked smoothly ahead and smiled gently, amused smile. "You may as well just set me up upon them like a dog." Her eyes glittered maliciously. It was all too easy for Lawrence to imagine Hollow cutting between the seriously lecturing Elsa and passionately studying Cole. No, that's not what I... So what did you mean?" Lawrence was at a loss for words. He rubbed his forehead with his hand. He wanted Hollow to be honest. He wanted her to stop forcing herself to wear a mask. But the idea of her acting without any restraint at all made his stomach hurt. He could hardly blame her for taking his words to mean he wanted her to act however she was most convenient for him. But why had he even bothered trying to tell her not to force herself to do things? Lawrence thought about it and finally settled on an answer. "If I must choose between you doing whatever you wish or forcing yourself to simply endure, then..." He took a breath. "I'd rather the former." Immediately, Hollow's nails dug into the palm of Lawrence's hand. "You're being tricky with your words again." She never overlooked such things. Lawrence furrowed his brow, then soon gave up. If he did not say it, she would never forgive him. He looked down at her, exhausted. "I think you're much more charming when you're honest and free to do as you like." Hollow grinned. She was obviously enjoying his embarrassed face, much more than his actual words. "I think you're much more charming when you're forcing yourself." Her nose crinkled. "I suppose I can't be an honorable wise wolf." Hollow smiled and faced forward. Her footsteps were light. "You're the one at fault for this, you know," she murmured. "Huh?" Hollow's red ambered eyes flashed at Lawrence, and she looked at him as though relishing her own mischief. "No matter what happens after this, I'll be to blame for none of it." Lawrence tried to reply, but a chill ran down his spine. "Wait," Hollow giggled. "'Twas a jest, you fool." She began to stride delightedly away. After Lawrence stumbled in his hurry to follow her, she continued, "Still, 'tis well for once in such a long life not to be thinking on past and future." She flashed her fangs in a charming smile.